They are taking our kids as a thing to say for those who have been isolated. Don't be worried, you have a voice today, so listen up everyone, here it is the story. Child Protective Services is real. CPS is what they we all think it won't. We say when they come, we will be so tough. It all sounds good, we'll want to take them. But when they come, your voice gets to breaking. Stay calm, step away. CPS ain't taking no one today. We are educated. Stay calm, step away. CPS, you need to leave up. I know that you're asleep. You can't do what you're trying to do. We've done our homework. Don't do a damn thing without a motive. You no longer feel like it. This is Tiff and the Punisher have come for the calling. That's the CPS. Their voice is out and clear. We stop and lose our kids. This Tiff wants to fight the entire planet. She is tired of kids being taken. God damn it. She's been fighting CPS for years, bringing children home from this disgusting. The Punisher is screaming, abolish CPS and down. I want all our kids to come back. Look at all those pictures held up by thin ties. Together we are stronger than we need. We will tear down CPS with high speed. We will put these of a feather. Flock together. Watch out, CPS, here we come. Picking you one by one. We promise to bring back the family and prosecute the case unhandily. So give us back the kids you have taken. Tiff Punisher sending you all on a vacation. On the bars and windows, and the only games you play are on Nintendo's. Coast, here we come. We must stop until love. Try to teach, learn what you stand. There's something about you learn.
Hi, Valerie.
Hey, Tiffany.
So I want to tell everybody that you're my special guest tonight. I actually met you after my daughter and mine case through our other delegate, Wendy DeGaius. And I absolutely love you.
I love you too.
You are on our team.
Yes.
So tell people about yourself. I can never ever say your last name. Is why I call you Miss V, Miss Valerie, Miss,
Okay. Yeah, I'm Valerie LaRue. It's harder it looks harder than it is. It's just LaRue. I work at Virginia Poverty Law Center. We're a statewide organization that works on trying to improve laws and policies that impact low-income people. And of course, one of those very important issues is in the area of the child welfare system, which includes CPS, it includes foster care, it includes the court system. And in my view, it also includes the social services system that is supposed to support families like SNAP, Medicaid, other forms like TANF of economic support. Because we know that generally it's not rich people's kids who are being taken by CPS. And a lot of times, things that CPS is investigating are really issues relating to family support and not relating to child neglect or child abuse. Now, obviously, we don't want children to be abused or neglected, but a lot of times that abuse or neglect is really in the eye of the beholder and not what's actually going on in the family. And that's the thing that is so very aggravating.
Yeah. I pulled up the National Coalition for Juvenile and Family Court, whatever it is. I don't have it in here. I didn't bring it. It said that they need to stop taking children due to poverty, because poverty does not alone is neglectful, right?
Right.
Of course, it all depends on who's interpreting abuse and neglect laws, right? And in Virginia, they are very vague.
Yep.
I know one of the things that they told my daughter, they said, well, you can look it up on our website. But our definition of abuse is the maturity of the child, right? Well, I don't believe that to be legitimate, because I have a 2-year-old that can outsmart me and I'm 54.
Yep. Yeah. So, it's unfortunately very, it takes complex issues, that our system takes complex issues and then reduces them to something really simple. And that's not what life is, right? We all know that life is much more complex than how CPS wants to view it. And, and that's the thing, is that, we know families are messy and life is messy. And so when we put everything in a box or make it try to fit behind a white picket fence, that's not what life is really like. And so, and, I think sometimes people are well-intentioned, but where does the, the road to hell is what? Paved with good intentions. So, so that's where we end up, right? And, and here's a really good example. And it's a kind of example that is very kind of clear cut. And so people can go, oh my God, that's horrible. And so this is a real case that is going on in Virginia right now. This mom had 3 kids, lived with her partner. I don't know the specifics. I don't know if they were married or not, but anyway, they lived together. The mom was not, she was an undocumented immigrant, and her partner was abusive. Well, one of the things that can happen with women when they're in abusive relationships is that CPS, so being exposed to domestic violence, even if the children aren't being abused themselves, can be considered abuse or neglect, because it's harmful to kids to observe, that kind of, be in that kind of environment. But it's not just the abuser who could be charged with abuse or neglect in that situation. It can be the victim, and she can be accused of failure to protect her children. So in this case, the mom did what the VDSS would tell people to do, and that is she reached out to the DSS and said, I need help getting away from this abusive partner. So they said, great, we'll get you away from the abusive partner. Well, of course, then, because the abusive partners had the money and had the house, then she didn't have a place to live. So they're like, well, one thing is the DSS, a lot of times the workers don't know what the law is. So the law is, obviously, if you're an undocumented immigrant, you don't have the right to access social services. But your children, if they are citizen children, your children do. So these children had the right to have DSS provide housing assistance for them to live in the house. And then their mom, because she's their mom, has the right to then live there with them, take care of them. But the DSS didn't know that, right? So instead of saying, oh, we need to help this mom, find a place to live because her children have a right to have a house to live in, instead, they put the children in foster care. Well, meanwhile, of course, the mom can't get a job. She can't get credit, none of those things, because the person who is providing that kind of support is her abuser that she can't live with any longer. And so she can't get any of those things. So now they're getting ready to terminate her rights because she can't find a place to live. And, who is suffering for that? The children. The children are suffering by losing their mom who loves them and did the right thing to protect them and get them out of an abusive situation. And meanwhile, these are 3 kids. So probably Virginia is probably paying like $500 a month ish for each child to the foster family. So that's like $1,500 a month. Well, that could certainly go to support paying rent for this family to live in. And since she is a victim of domestic violence, she would be eligible under the Violence Against Women Act as long as she cooperates with any investigation. So the Violence Against Women Act, if you're a victim of violence and you cooperate with the police to do an investigation, and actually there's also another U visa that is for any person who is undocumented. If they are a victim of a crime and cooperate with law enforcement, you have to get an affidavit from the law enforcement that you were cooperative, all that kind of stuff. And it takes a very long time and it's a lot of paperwork, but you can get a visa. So the VDSS could have, since she was cooperating with CPS, they could have helped her to get that kind of visa so that she then would have had the documentation that she needed, so she would even qualify for housing assistance. But in any case, instead, they're giving all this money to the foster family to raise these children. We know it's traumatic for children to be separated from their parents. I mean, anyone who's been a child, and you know what, 100% of people have been a child. You know how traumatic it is to be away from your parent. You know what it was like to go to this fair and suddenly you don't know where your parent is. You got separated by the crowd. You freak out, right? And that's even when it's just for a few minutes. Then you see your mom in the distance or whatever it is. It's traumatic to be separated from your parent. And you could say, well, if a parent is abusive, then the trauma of being separated is overwhelmed by the trauma of being abused. And you know what? That's true if the parent is being super abusive. We always hear these cases in the media about somebody who put their kid in a closet and, beat them with a stick and didn't let them eat anything. That's like half of 1% of the cases that come to CPS. Yes, those children should be taken away from those people. But are the vast majority of parents who come to the attention of CPS those people? No. And so, why is it that we are traumatizing these 3 children whose mother did everything right and who could qualify if they helped her get what she needed under a VAWA petition or a U visa petition? But in any case, even if they didn't help her with those, and if she didn't qualify for those, her children would qualify for housing, and she would then qualify to live in the house with them as their mother and take care of them. But instead, we're giving all this money, probably around $1,500, which, in a lot of parts of Virginia, that would be enough to pay for a home, rent a home for a family of 4. And the fact that instead those children, if they're terminating their rights to those children might end up being legal orphans and having, being bounced from foster home to foster home for the rest of their childhood. And then, having no family at all when they become adults, which Virginia has a very high rate of what's called aging out of foster care, or, the technical term is emancipating out of foster care. And that's when you get to be an adult, which in Virginia, you can emancipate at 18 or 21. You're allowed to stay in foster care until 21 and gain all the benefits of support that are available to you. A lot of kids don't want to do that. And the reason is because they want to go back home.
Mm-hmm.
Screw being in foster care. I want to go back home. And so this is really interesting. And I hope that if there are kids who are listening or families who are aware of this, when a child reaches the age of 18, they're now, of course, an adult. They can choose who they want to live with. If they can stay in the program and get those financial supports, which, by the way, can help them to go on to college or go to trade school or do an apprenticeship. And the place that they can live with their parent, because now they're 18. Nobody can tell them who they can and can't live with. Still eligible to get that financial support. And so a lot of kids don't know that, and a lot of CPSs probably don't even tell them. But anyway, that's just an example of how a person can lose their children, lose their parental rights permanently, and have done everything right. That is a horrific story. And it's, not every story is that sort of clean and neat, because like I said, families are messy, but it's just one example of how that can happen.
Well, I looked up the Virginia second chance law for parental rights. Now, let me ask you, because I've never heard of anybody getting their kids back, even when their rights were reinstated. Can they repetition the courts to get their kids back, or it's too late?
So, the Virginia has what's called a restoration of parental rights law. And the problem is, and actually I was just talking to a legislator about this a few weeks ago, because of another situation that is like probably an outlier, but nonetheless, these things happen. So under the restoration of parental rights law in Virginia, the parent cannot petition for it. Instead, it has to be either the child through their guardian ad litem, or the DSS has to petition for it. And so most of the time they're not going to do it. It's very, very rare. It does happen on occasion, but it's very rare. So this case that I heard about from a legislator in Southwest Virginia is a case where the child's adoptive parents died, and the birth parent was very, very young when the child was removed, and now they're older and they're a different person. They have other children, and but they don't have a right under the law to petition themselves, and so there's nothing that they can do. And I do think that is, I think that's wrong. I think that, I know that how the legislators look at it and how the courts look at it is, they don't want the court space to be clogged with people coming forward and saying, I want my rights restored. I want my rights restored. And obviously, if the child has been adopted, then there's nothing you can do. The child, you can't go back then. But if the child hasn't been adopted, is it better for the child to be it's called being a legal orphan. If you are not adopted and your parents' rights have been terminated, you are a legal orphan, even though your parents are not alive. And, the sad thing about that is it doesn't matter. Like, let's say your birth parent wins the lottery and has $1 million. Well, and then they die. Well, you can't inherit that $1 million because they are not your parent. So unless they wrote a will that says, I want my money to go to this person, then you're not going to get that. Or, even just ordinary things like, retirement funds or things like that somebody might inherit. You can't. So it's really, it used to be that the state was not supposed to terminate a parent's rights unless they had an adoptive family lined up, but they changed that law a number of years ago. And the idea was to, free children up for adoption. And part of that is there is an adoption industry out there of people who want to adopt children, who intentionally become foster parents, not because they want to be foster parents and do what they sign a piece of paper saying that they will do. And that is to help foster the relationship between the child and their parents so that they can reunite. They do not. Instead, they are just biding their time and hoping that they will be able to adopt the child. And, there was an interesting case a couple years ago in Virginia where these would-be foster parents, and I say would-be because the first thing they did was they tried to get approved to be foster parents in one jurisdiction, and they were told, no, you don't qualify to be foster parents. So they moved somewhere else, and they applied again. And in the second place, they were told, yes, you can be, we will approve you as foster parents. So they fostered these kids, and meanwhile, the mom was working her services plan, doing all the right things, and the children were returned to her. Well, those people were not happy about it. And so they filed in court to get those kids back. And it went all the way up to the Virginia Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals said, no, you cannot get these kids back. You have to show that somehow the children would be harmed to be with their mother. And you haven't shown that, so no, you don't win. And we're really lucky that the Virginia Court of Appeals has done that, because in other states, this is a strategy that these, would-be adoptive parents are doing across the country. And in some states, they're winning. It's basically they are filing, and we actually saw this in another family. This is before we unfortunately didn't get involved soon enough to be able to refer them to an attorney or anything, but where that exactly happened. The foster parent went and filed their own petition for adoption rather than waiting for the DSS. The DSS is supposed to file a foster care plan that says it's for the best interest of the child, for the parent's rights to be terminated, and for the child to be adopted. But these people just went to court and filed their own adoption petition. And that's happening across the country. So this is a strategy that these, foster to adopt people are doing. And it's really sad, because some of these people have more money than the birth parent, and there's a lot of prejudice around there. I represented a mom once in a case, and the child's guardian ad litem came to the hearing with these photographs of the house that the foster family lived in. And it was a big fancy house, had a swimming pool, all this stuff. And she was showing me these pictures, and she was like, oh, and they're taking her to Disney World. And I was like, so effing what? That's not the standard that applies. The standard that applies is this mother a safe place for her children to live with, a safe person to care for the child? It doesn't matter that that mom can't afford to take the child to Disney World, or does or doesn't have a swimming pool, or can't afford ballet lessons. It's not, sometimes I tell people, human children are not puppies. You can't be like, oh, this is a nicer house with a big backyard, and the puppy would be happier there. Children belong to the people that they're born to. And until it's been proven that, first of all, that they were a danger to their child in one way or another, and second, that they cannot rehabilitate themselves by whatever the issue is, getting themselves clean from drugs, or, coming up with a harm reduction plan, or, if the issue was they didn't know, safe ways for the child to live, or whatever it is, their house is a huge mess, if they're able to rehabilitate themselves and follow their services plan and do the right thing, then the child should come home. And some of these DSSs keep raising the bar. They'll say, okay, here's your service plan. If you do X, Y, and Z, then your child can come home. And the parent is like, okay, I'll do X, Y, and Z. And they do all of it. They go to the parenting class. They go to therapy. They get a, mental health evaluation. If they didn't have the right kind of, house, like not enough bedrooms or whatever it is, or the kid's bedroom wasn't, was too messy or whatever, they fix up the bedroom, whatever it is, they do all those things. And then they go back to the DSS and they say, okay, I did everything that you asked of me. And they're like, oh, great. Well, now you have to do all these other things. And that is moving the goalposts. That is really not fair. And who is being harmed here? It's the child who's being harmed. Like in one case, the mom that I had a number of years ago, the mom was going to family therapy with the child, and everything was going great. And they're like, okay, we're on track to reunite you and your child. And by the way, the mom did nothing that caused this child to enter into foster care, except that she was arrested for trying to hurt her abuser. And so she had to go into jail. So while she was in jail serving her sentence, her child was in foster care because there was no one to care for the child. So she comes out, and it's not like, okay, here's your child back now that you're out of jail. It's like, oh, before your child can return, you need to do X, Y, and Z. So one of those was do this family therapy. So she did the family therapy. She was getting time off from work. She didn't have a car, so she had to get somebody to drive her to go to the family therapy, but she was doing it every week. And they're like, okay, this family therapy is going great. So guess what? We really want the child to return to you. So we want you to go now to family therapy twice a week. Well, she didn't go twice a week. Well, why is that? Well, we all know, right? Because first of all, then I'm sure her boss was already like, okay, yeah, you have to go to your therapy once a week. I understand you need to get your kid back. Okay. Well, it's one thing to ask your boss to give you, 1 hour a week off to go to, well, it's really longer than an hour, right? So the therapy is an hour, but you have to get picked up and taken there, and then you have to be brought back. So it's really 3 hours. So it's really 3 hours a week. So now you're asking for another 3 hours a week, basically, to go to the second therapy. And then, again, she didn't have a car. So again, you have to get somebody to pick her up and take her there, somebody to bring her back. So she didn't go to the second therapy appointment. And unfortunately, I didn't represent her at that time. It wasn't till later. So I got the case when the attorney who was representing her got a different job and couldn't represent her anymore. And so they asked me if I would take it, and I did. So she said, oh, everything was going great until she stopped going to therapy. So I went to her and I said, so why did you stop going to therapy? And that's when she told me, well, they told me that if here's why I didn't go to the second appointment. And then they told me, well, if you don't go to the second appointment, then we're not going to recommend that your child be returned. And so then I thought, well, then why am I going to the first appointment? If my child's not going to be returned, why am I, asking for this hour a week off and blah, 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 blah. And so I just stopped going altogether. I was like, if somebody had been there for her and said, this is ridiculous, you have moved the goalposts and that's not fair. You told her to do this. She did it. Write a foster care plan that says that she should return to her mom, then we wouldn't be in this boat. And, it's just a very unfair system. The deck is completely stacked against the families. Once the child goes into foster care, that timeline is really fast. The federal timeline says that the department is supposed to file a petition to terminate parental rights if the child has been in foster care for 15 out of the last 22 months. But Virginia says after 12 months. And so that is really not very much time when you're talking about people with not very much income who are struggling just to survive, and who a lot of times the service plan doesn't even get put into effect until several months after the case has started. And so then it's really more than, or less than a year, because by the time the service plan actually gets into effect, because if you're told to, go to family therapy, well, guess what? It's not like you just show up at the therapist's office and say, oh, I'm here for therapy. And they're like, okay, fine, come on in. They're like, oh, we are booked up for 6 months out. And so, this timeline goes really, really fast when you're looking at those things. And if, God forbid, you have a substance use disorder, well, we all know that you can't get over a substance use disorder in 12 months. It takes a long time. And part of the process is to relapse and things like that. And so, does our system say, oh, it's okay. We know that relapsing is part of, the healing process. No, they're like, ooh, that's strike one. The system is really stacked against people. It's really unfair. And the people who are being harmed by this are children. And, Tiffany, you and I were talking about this earlier. We're not talking about the parents who are the horrible ones that you read about in the news. Yes, we understand that there are horrible people out there. And yes, there are horrible people who should never be in charge of children. But, the vast majority of reports to CPS, first of all, are screened out as being invalid. And so then you take that, and then when you take the valid cases and start looking at those, CPS has what they call a differential system. So when a report comes into CPS, it has to meet the factors for validity. And that has to do with things like, is the person the actual caretaker of the child? Is the child an actual child under age of 18? Does it meet the standard for abuse or neglect or not? So first they have to go through all that analysis. So once they screen out all the cases don't meet that, Then they have to look at, is this child really in danger or not? And so then they divide that into cases that are investigated versus cases that are called family assessment. So a family assessment says, well, this isn't really abuse or neglect, but maybe this family, maybe somebody called CPS because this family needs some help. And so a family assessment is supposed to be like, well, what does this family need? And then, so they do an assessment and they say, okay, this family could use this, they could use that, and then they're supposed to offer those services to the family, which the family can say yes or no to. So only a small number of cases that go through that process actually end up into an actual investigation. And only a small number of those cases actually end up being removals. So there's not this whole epidemic of child abuse and child neglect happening out there. There really is not. It's really a very small number. But, the national organization, Prevent Child Abuse America, they have acknowledged now that they actually came up with a really interesting term. They called it health terrorism. And that term means when you think there's a problem that people aren't paying attention to, and so you make the problem to seem much worse than it is so that people will pay attention. Well, that's what happened with child abuse and neglect. So now everybody thinks that child abuse and neglect is happening all around them. And so now what they're doing is everybody, is picking up the phone and calling CPS, and the legislature is constantly adding people to the list of the mandated reporters. So for last year, we actually there was a bill to add someone to the list of mandated reporters, and that person would have been inspectors from the Department of Labor. And the reason why they thought they were going to add that was because there is an uptick in violations of child labor laws. And, there are employers who are hiring youth who can get a job, but then putting them into roles that they're not supposed to have. Like, so for a youth is not supposed to do something that's dangerous. They're not supposed to work with dangerous chemicals or materials. They're not supposed to work, more than a certain number of hours. They're not supposed to work, longer than a certain length of day, all those kinds of things. So I guess what they thought was that if a Department of Labor employee came into a factory, let's say, and saw a child, working with dangerous chemicals, that they could then report them to CPS. Well, guess what? They can't, because a factory owner or foreman in a factory or whatever, employer, is not a caretaker of a child. So that would be an invalid report. If you called CPS and said, there's a, company down the street and they've got 10 children working for them and they're working dangerous machinery, CPS would say, that's not a valid complaint. We can't respond to that. The Department of Labor employee is a person who does something, and it's not called CPS. It's charging the employer with a violation of child labor laws, right? And so, but it's very hard for people to understand that. They're like, well, that must be abuse or neglect of children. I'm like, no, it's not abusive or neglect of children, because you have to be a caretaker of a child all within the ambit of the law. And so if somebody comes into a factory and says, oh, this child is working, overtime or whatever it is, the employer is not going to be charged. Who's going to be charged? The parent is going to be charged, not the employer. And so what is going to happen is family businesses, including farms. I grew up on a farm. I work on the farm. I drove a tractor. And by the way, let me tell you, my parents didn't let me drive a tractor until I was 16. But my brother, who's 3 years younger, as soon as I turned 16 and I drove a tractor and nothing happened to me, then they let him drive a tractor when he was 13. And I was like, this is so unfair. How come he gets to drive it when he's 13? He should have to wait till he's 16 too. But that's totally an aside. But in any case, so, the Department of Labor goes to the farm and says, oh, the parents are letting the child drive a tractor, let's say. Well, they're the ones that are going to be charged with child abuse or neglect. And so I went to, it was funny getting people to wrap their heads around it, getting the legislators to wrap their heads around it. It was so hard. It was funny because like during the hearing, I, spoke against the bill. And then when the proponents of the bill were up there talking about it, I was standing there going, you can see them looking at me and saying, why is she shaking her head? This sounds like a good bill. And I'm like, and it was really funny because, and actually one of the legislators texted, she didn't have my number, so she texted someone else in my office. And that person came running up the hill from our office to the General Assembly. And she came in the room and she goes, why are you opposing this bill? I'm like, I just told them I'm opposing the bill. And she's like, they don't understand. And I'm like, well, then why don't they ask me? Anyway, we did kill the bill. We finally got through to them and they're like, well, what if the child really is being abused by their parents? I'm like, you know what? Nothing stops anyone at any time from picking up the phone and calling CPS. You don't have to add them to the mandated reporter list. If they see a child being abused, they can pick up the phone just like you or I can. They don't have to be a mandated reporter. And right now we have so many people who are mandated reporters and they are calling CPS. And the reason why is because it is a misdemeanor to not report what you think is child abuse or neglect. Even if it's not child abuse or neglect, if you think it is, it's a misdemeanor to not do so. So it's a CYA situation. And in some states, and California has just started doing this, they're starting to do what's called mandated supporting instead of mandated report. And I think that is a great concept. And the concept is, so, probably the most reports to CPS come from school teachers. So let's say a kid comes to school and their clothes are dirty, right? And the teacher is like, oh, this child is being neglected. Nobody washed their clothes. So they pick up the phone and they call CPS and say, this child is being neglected. They come to school with dirty clothes. And so CPS investigates. Well, under mandated supporting, the teacher would be like, I wonder why this child comes to school with dirty clothes. Maybe the teacher goes to the parent and says, hey, I notice, your son is coming to school with dirty clothes. What's going on? Well, maybe the teacher will say, or the parent will say, well, we lost our home and we're living out of our car and I don't always have money to go to the laundromat. And so I'm recycling the clothes. Well, in some school districts, what they've done is they've put a laundromat in the school. And then homeless families can come to the school and do their laundry there. Well, isn't that a hell of a lot better than the children being taken away from their parents just because they couldn't afford to wash their kids' clothes? So that's what mandated supporting means. That means be a problem solver, figure out what's going on, figure out how to solve the problem. Don't pass the buck to CPS because CPS is basically a form of the police. In fact, a lot of people call it family policing. And it's not, again, if you're talking about someone who is truly horrifically neglecting or abusing children, then yes. But that kind of situation, like I just described, that is poverty. That is struggle. I heard about another case where father was living in a home where he rented like the upstairs of a house, and the homeowner lived in the house. So the homeowner was an old man and he died. Well, the electricity and water were in the homeowner's name, not in the dad's name. And so when he died, there was no way for the father to get the water and electricity turned back on because after he died, he stopped paying the bill because he was dead. And so the water and electricity got shut off. And so that was a situation where the kid is like showing up to school without being bathed. And so the teacher is like, what's going on? Well, we don't have any water or electricity. Well, so what? They remove the child from the dad because the dad can't provide water to give the child a bath. But it's not the father's fault. He did nothing wrong. He just is poor and lives in a house with, owned by an old man who dies, and there's nobody that will turn the water and power back on. He probably would have paid the bill if it had been turned on, but he's not the homeowner and he can't do it because it's not in his name. And so they said, well, we're going to give you X number of days, to find a new place to live. and, or get the water and power turned back on, or we're going to move to terminate your rights. And that should not be happening. If they can't provide, a way, they have lawyers, the dad doesn't have one, they should be figuring out how to get this family into a situation where this is not happening, rather than just saying, oh, we're going to put your child in foster care. And that's the kind of thing that just makes me so angry and upset, because about most of the funding for foster care comes from the federal government, Title IV funding. It comes from the various acts that have been passed over the years to, protect children and, put them in foster care if they're being abused. And so that money cannot be typically spent on, so they can't take those Title IV dollars, because they're mostly designed to be spent to pay for foster care, not to pay for families' needs. And so it skews the system. It provides this incentive to put children in foster care, because that's where, if the child needs help. And we even see that, and I'm sorry, I'm sort of digressing here, but I didn't attend this meeting yesterday because there was something going on in my neighborhood that I wanted to keep an eye on. And so I didn't go to the meeting, but there has been a lot of cases of parents relinquishing their custody of their children to foster care. And the reason is because their child has, emotional behavioral issues, and there's no way that they can get their child help because they can't afford it. And they go to various places and say, well, this is how much it costs to get this service for our child and that service. And they're like, well, we can't afford that. And nobody's paying for this unless the child goes into foster care, and then they automatically pay for it. Well, a parent shouldn't be going to the state and saying, put my child in foster care because he needs help and this is the only way he's going to get help. That should not be happening. The Family First Prevention Services Act, which passed in 2018 and went in effect into 2019, was supposed to put some of that money up front into, prevention of entry into foster care. But the problem is that the services that it will cover are very limited, and it has to do with things like parenting classes, family therapy, stuff like that. Well, that's all well and good. A lot of people need parenting classes. A lot of people would benefit from family therapy. But it doesn't address real needs, like the woman who doesn't have a house to live in, or the dad who doesn't have the water turned on. It doesn't help when, you're living out of your car. They're not using that money for those things, but it does pay the foster family to have the child stay in their house. And that is just a fundamentally flawed system.
It's backwards.
Yep.
Right. And the article that I did, you sent me an email like you're the star, and I was like, what? She used my heading. My very first words to her was, it's all to set parents up. That's all it is. The whole system. It's designed to make parents fail, because as long as the kids are in foster care, the state collects the money.
Now, I will say that they have to spend money to get money. Mm-hmm. So how it works, they have this very complicated system. It's a matching fund. So the state has to spend its money first in order to draw down the money. And they only get a certain percentage of the money, and that is what's called the penetration rate. So it's so not every case qualifies for Title IV-E. And there's a number of different reasons why a case might not qualify for a Title IV-E. So one thing is a child is not a citizen. That's not Title IV eligible because federal funds can't be used for non-citizens. So only citizen children would be a Title IV-E. Another thing is if the proper documentation wasn't done. So before a child is removed from their home, they're supposed to do all this documentation. The court is supposed to follow certain procedures, et cetera, et cetera. So if they either don't do the proper procedures or they don't document them properly, then that is not a Title IV-E qualified. So every case has to be properly done and properly documented in order to qualify for Title IV-E funds. And then whatever percentage of the cases as a whole that the state has that are Title IV qualified, Virginia gets half of its expenditures for that. So like in 2022, I think our quote unquote, again, penetration rate, I hate using that word, but sounds like something different. It was around 23%. So the state has to spend, 75% of the dollars to get the 23%. So it's not like they're just raining down money and that they can do whatever they want with. But it is a significant amount of money, and it's not based on income, and there's no cutoff. It's unlimited. So if you were able to get your penetration rate up to 50%, which Virginia has gotten close to that a number of times. And in fact, for a while, Virginia was under what's called a PIP, Program Improvement Plan, because Virginia's data collection system is super old. It's like 30 years old. It's older than my child. And he's an adult who lives in Chicago. And it doesn't collect a lot of the statistics that are required to be reported to the federal government. And so when workers are entering all the data into their case, a lot of the data they're entering is not the data that needs to be collected. So instead, they have to collect that separately on paper. Well, what happened was with that, they forget, they lose it, they don't write the right thing down. And so then when the county DSS goes to report to the state, and the state then takes all of that and reports it to the federal government, a lot of times they're missing data. And so that's one of the reasons why Virginia has a low penetration rate, because and the department has finally gotten an appropriation from the state government to build a modern data collection system. That was a couple of years ago. It still hasn't shown up. I don't know where they are in the process. But I'll tell you, I started doing this work in the fall of 2016. And the very first time I attended a meeting of the Child Welfare Advisory Committee, which was like the first month I started working at this job, they were talking about needing to replace that system, and that they had, they've been talking about getting, proposals, blah, 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 blah. So where are we now? 2014. So that's 8 years that they've been talking about this, and I still haven't seen it. So I don't know when they'll get it. But that's another complicating factor in Virginia.
So I know, well, first let me address the school thing. So when I registered my grandson for kindergarten, they gave me this piece of paper and it was like, where do you live? In a house, in a car, and all these other things, right? And I'm like, because where my mind went. I'm like, this is a setup. Absolutely not. If anybody's smart, they would not check I'm living in a car. So I did this thing. I called my friend because, people think that I'm just this little big mouth blonde bitch, but I have friends in high places, believe me. So I called my friend. I said, hey, I know the schools contract out with CPS, and I'm getting ready to serve them with some paperwork. And she's like, wait a minute, let me get you a meeting. I said, okay. I think I told you about this. So I gave them the letter, and I haven't had any problems. And my little kindergartner will get on the bus because he brushed his teeth, and I have to run the other one to daycare. So I come back, and the bus is coming. He's got toothpaste on his shirt, and I'm like, oh my God, here we go.
There you go.
Right, there we go.
He's showing up to school with toothpaste on his shirt. What's going on with this family?
But I also want to know, I know that the judges here are set in their ways. Okay. I believe the child is being abused. I need a removal order. Right. Now, you and I talked about this before. Do you believe that judges should consistently go to training on these issues? Because I do.
I absolutely do. And I'll tell you, it's really interesting to see how, like, I was talking to the director of the DSS in Henrico County, and she was saying, "Oh, our judges just, won't terminate parents' rights." And I'm like, "Yes, good for them." And she's
Right?
like, "Oh, Valerie, these families are terrible. Even you would believe that their rights should be terminated." I'm like, yeah, okay, well, try me and then I'll see. But so those judges have actually, obviously gotten together and talked about this, and they've decided that they want a higher standard of proof before, they're removing children and terminating parents' rights. Whereas in other places, the judges are, more set in their ways, maybe older, maybe like, I don't know what it is, but they're basically removing all children and holding the parents to a super high standard. And one of the things, for instance, that I've seen is so under, Virginia, another thing to know about Virginia is what's called a state supervised, locally administered system. What that means is that there's 128 different DSS agencies in Virginia, and all of them basically do whatever the hell they want, however they want it. And some of them don't even follow the law, but even if they do follow the law, they don't necessarily follow the guidance. And Virginia has these big fat manuals that tell them everything they're supposed to do. And one of the things that they're supposed to do is, effectuate visitation between a parent and a child. And they have very strict instructions about, well, what if the parent is, using substances? Well, what they're supposed to do is if the parent shows up and is clearly intoxicated, they're not supposed to allow the visit to go through. But if they're not intoxicated, then they're not supposed to do anything but let the visit go and happen. Well, there are judges in Virginia that even if the DSS is like, well, we want this family to have visitation, the judge will be like, well, I want them to be tested before every visit, and they test positive, then they shouldn't have a visit. Well, we all know that marijuana, for example, stays in your system for 30 days. So who's to say whether they're, using drugs today, yesterday, last week, a month ago? Nobody, right?
It's legal here.
Exactly. And I feel like, and so I've been working on a bill for the last couple of years, and it's been killed 2 years in a row, and it's probably not going to be brought back this year there because last year it was vetoed by Governor Youngkin. So I think that the proponents of the bill are probably like, well, we know if we go through all this process of getting the bill passed, it's just going to be vetoed again. So let's not bother. Let's wait till he's out and we'll try again. But it really is unfair. It's like a setup, like you were saying. So, marijuana is legal now. I can smoke. Well, not if if the judge sends you back to be tested when you come into court and you test positive, and they're like, well, sorry, I'm not going to allow visitation, and if you're not clean. And we all have seen that. And I've also seen judges tell parents, well, you're on medication assisted treatment, which, by the way, is the gold standard for someone who has an opioid addiction, whether it's, buprenorphine, or whether it's, one of the older drugs that people, used to get at clinics, that, fills the space in your brain that is addicted to the opioid. And doctors tell a lot of people, look, your brain is always going to, crave that. And no person is stronger than that craving. And so you're always going to have to be on this medication if you don't want to have a relapse. Well, judges and DSSs are telling parents, well, if you want your child back, you need to wean yourself off of the medication assisted treatment. Well, that's not right, because that puts them at risk for relapse. And so to tell a parent you can't be on this medication that keeps you clean, if you want to get your kids back, is absolutely wrong. And again, it's the children who are suffering. So if we're doing this to protect children, that's not what we're doing. And it just is so painful because, we know that Big Pharma was pushing those opioids, and the doctors were pushing it, and people, get some kind of, get in an accident, have some kind of repetitive work injury, they take a painkiller and they get addicted. And now they can't even take the medication that would help them with their addiction so that they're not, an unsafe option for their child, that's really unfair. And, again, as we said earlier, it's not rich people's children who are being taken away. And we know rich people use drugs, they drink alcohol. This is, a problem that affects poor people, even though there's no statistics to show that poor people are more likely to be addicted than rich people. Everybody is at risk for that. It's partly genetics, it's partly your life story. Back when I was a public defender, I learned that a lot of my female clients, whatever the charge was that brought them, into the criminal justice system, a lot of times the thing that was driving that charge was that they had an addiction problem. And one of the things I learned was that if they had an addiction problem, a lot of times it was because they were abused as children. And we see that also in the foster care system. People are abused as children. They take drugs as self-medication. And that's because we don't have a good system that helps people with their mental health, helps them deal with trauma. And then they're taking drugs because they are in constant emotional pain. And then what happens? Their children are taken away. So we didn't protect those women when they were children. And now we are compounding the injury that we did to them as children by taking their children away now and harming them. Mm-hmm. And that causes intergenerational harm. And one of the things that doesn't get talked about a lot is that, like I said, and we know that poor people are much more likely to have CPS, policing them, but Black families are even more likely to be in that system. And they are much more likely, people are much more likely to assume that something that they see is abuse or neglect. And that harm that is inflicted on Black communities and Black families is passed down generationally. I have seen so many families where they were in foster care, their kids are now in foster care. Well, are we helping those families to learn how to be not traumatized by our society and to be good parents and be nurturing parents? No. We're taking the children away. Are the children learning how to be, a good parent by being placed with a foster family who doesn't really care about them? No. We are just passing the harm down from one generation to the next. And it's really causing harm to families and to children. And it's just really sad. It really breaks my heart.
Well, I know since my daughter's case, she's had a couple incidences with her son where he slapped her in her face in the grocery store and tried to steal this lady's purse, right? She had a mental breakdown. And when she called me, I said, "Why are you crying? Why isn't he crying?" She said, "Mom, I'm the only Black woman in here with a Black kid. All these people would call CPS on me."
Yeah, that's unfortunately really true.
She's traumatized. She has PTSD. She was, to this day, we can't even talk about her case because she gets so emotional. And the adoption or the foster families, I never thought about it the way you put it, where they want to adopt but don't want to sit on no list or whatever, so they become potential foster parents. That's what happened to my middle daughter. After they adopted my daughter, they took no more foster children in. They got what they wanted, my daughter. Now that makes sense. They targeted her.
Yep. And, it used to be that people who, couldn't have children for whatever reason and, wanted to adopt, they were doing international adoptions. But a lot of countries have said that they're no longer allowing that. And so, a big source of children to be adopted has dried up. And so now they're seeking, and one of the things that blew my mind when I first started doing this work, I was reading about the CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act or whatever, when it was reauthorized, I think in the 90s. Been a while since I've, done that, dived into all that federal law stuff. That timeline, that 15 out of the last 22 months, who was lobbying to shorten the timeline and make it as limited as possible. It was lobbyists for the adoption industry. So when I read that, I was like, oh my God. So basically, you don't care about the children. You're here lobbying for the interests of people who want to adopt children. And so rather than saying what's best for the kids, you're arguing for what's best for people who want to adopt, foster families who specifically foster so they can adopt. And recently somebody reached out to me and said, oh, this foster family called me. The child that they're fostering, the mom lives in another state, and, she's not very stable, but the DSS is planning to reunite the child with the mom. And she wants to, can I refer her to you to talk to you about her rights? And I'm like, no.
Tell the mom to call me.
Exactly. I will talk to pretty much anyone about these issues and, talk about their rights, give them information, tell them where to go to find more information. But, I'm not going to help someone keep their a family separated. No, I'm not going to give them advice and help. Now, sometimes it's interesting to me. Sometimes foster families will call me and they will say, I feel like the DSS is not doing what they should be doing to reunite the child I'm caring for with the parent. And the parent is doing a great job and the child should be back with them. But instead of putting the child back with their parent, they're doing something else. They're taking, we questioned what they were doing. And so they're taking the child away from us and putting them with a different foster family. And I'm like, that shouldn't be happening. Every time you disrupt a child's placement, that makes it so much harder for them. Why are they, if you can't put them at home, then keep them in the foster family where they are. And I've had foster families call and say, we feel like the child is on too much medication. But when we said something about it, they took the child away from us and put them in a different. And I'm like, I always hear these agencies talk about how there's not enough foster families, but somehow they have enough extra foster families that they just hop children around and put them here or put them there. We know that is not good for children. That is disruptive. You disrupted them by taking away from their parents, and now you're disrupting them again. That should not be happening.
And as adults, I can tell you, because my own children told me, it makes them feel unwanted, unloved, unstable as adults. They oftentimes get disassociation disorders. So we're just re-traumatizing these kids. I thank God every day that I was, first of all, smart enough to know how the system works. And second, that I was able to take my grandkids, right? Because absolutely not will you will not traffic my grandchildren through this system. Over my dead body. They will literally have to kill me.
Well, I will say that there is a national movement afoot to, and it's being called different things in different places, and different people have different ways of looking at it. But people are starting to talk about, like I said, a lot of people are calling it the family policing system, the family regulation system. And, rather than the child welfare system, because is the system really for the welfare of children or not? And we don't think that it is. And so there are calls to abolish CPS entirely, or, like I said, to switch from mandatory reporting to mandatory supporting, or to do what's called, in New York, they have a coalition called Narrowing the Front Door. Limiting the way, how do children come into the system? How can we make that narrower so that fewer children come into the system? And, there's been a lot of studies and programs. And the problem is, you have a study or a program and it's like, oh, this works. But then why don't we put it into place? So, for instance, there have been programs that show that if a child is put in foster care, that actually the reuniting the family happens much better if, right now in Virginia, if you put a child in foster care, the parent they're not even told like where the child lives, the names of the people who are caring for the child. They keep them completely separate. And so, but in pilots and studies where what they've done instead is that the foster family and the parent work together for the child. So let's say, you know, the parent comes over after work and helps the child do their homework after dinner, helps them go to bed, or comes over before they go to school and helps them get ready for school. You know, first of all, that makes them feel like they are part of the child's life, makes the child feel like, oh, good, I get to see mom every morning before I go to school. If the problem was, you know, we know that sometimes children come into foster care because the mom was very young, didn't really know how to be a parent. Maybe she didn't have, you know, maybe she was in foster care or whatever, you know, then the foster parent can help model, you know, well, this is how, you know, you get the kid ready in the morning without losing your mind. Because we all know as parents that we can lose our minds pretty easily getting a kid ready for school in the morning while we're also trying to get ready for work. And meanwhile, the kid is supposed to be getting dressed and you're making their lunch and you go to their bedroom and they're still sitting there playing with their toys or whatever. And you're like, you know, that's stressful. And not everybody knows how to handle that moment, you know. And so if you have someone to model that and say, hey, we've discovered that it works really well. If you just say, hey, if you're not dressed in 5 minutes, then we're going to come in and pick out your clothes for you and stand over you while you get dressed, rather than, you know, screaming or whatever it is. You know, that those have been very successful in helping parents to prove that that they're ready for the child to come back with them, rather than having some social worker just say to the judge, oh, you know, I don't think she's ready yet. Well, here we have proof because they're doing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And another thing is that when sometimes they do, you know, you sent me an email today about hidden foster care. So hidden foster care is when a judge doesn't remove a child and put them in foster care, but instead the DSS worker, the CPS worker says to the parent, oh, do you have a grandmother, an aunt, or somebody like that the child can go live with? And then you can, you know, do what you need to do to get yourself back together, either with help or half the time not any help at all. That when that grandmother or aunt, whoever they are, takes the child in, they're told, well, you can't let the mom come and visit the child, you know, unless you're with them every minute, or only on Tuesdays and you have to be there with them every minute, or only every other Tuesday, or whatever it is. Well, again, is the parent learning how to, you know, care for the child in that situation? They're not. It's very artificial. But what if instead of saying, oh, your child is going to go live with grandma, what if we had it so that both of them went and lived with grandma, or grandma came and lived in the house and provided that kind of support? You know, that would be much a better system, keeping families together, keeping a family unit together. And instead, the system we have now, then it kind of pits the parent and the relative against each other. You know, sometimes the grandparent will go get custody of the child, and then the parent loses what's called the parental presumption, which is under the law, the parent is presumed to be the best person to have custody of the child. Once the court gives custody of the child to someone else, the parent loses that presumption. And, you know, sometimes people will come to me and say, oh, you know, my daughter, you know, wants me to have the child because right now, or the way her life is, she can't care for the child, you know, so should I get custody? And I'm like, well, if you really want your daughter to eventually, you know, be able to take the child back, I would recommend that if you do go get custody, that you get joint custody with your daughter so that she won't lose the parental presumption, so that you can go back to court in 6 months or a year or whatever it is and say, child has been living with me, mom has been taking the child on the weekends or whatever. And, you know, but now she's gotten herself back on her feet. She has a good job. She has a house, whatever it is. And we want sole custody to go back to her. And the judge is like, okay, well, the parent never lost their parental presumption. So, you know, those kinds of arrangements. And frankly, you know, we all know it takes a village to raise a child. You know, in the past, people lived in multi-generational homes and everybody took care of the child. You know, it's really the 20th century where people started living in their own little box, you know, mom and dad and a little kid that, you know, that we call the nuclear family. That is really an artificial construct. That's not something that has ever happened in human history before. Before, people always lived in intergenerational homes. And in fact, in a lot of places, they still do, including in other countries like in Europe. Like when my son went off to college, somebody that I knew who was from Germany was like, oh, well, what are you going to do after college? And he goes, oh, well, I guess I'll get a job and get an apartment and all that stuff. And they're like, oh, so you're not going to come home and live with your mom? And he goes, no. Well, because in the US, that's considered to be weird, right? Like, you haven't been a good parent. If your child comes back and lives with you after they go off and establish themselves, that's considered weird. Well, in Europe, you just automatically do that. You don't leave home. Maybe when you get married, then you do. But otherwise, you live at home, and especially in a place like Italy. And so earlier we talked about, my French name. Well, the other half of my family is Italian. Well, in Italy, people live in multi-generational families still, and sometimes even after they get married. So, it's artificial to say, oh, this is a family unit and nobody else can live there. That's really artificial. And we should be more thinking outside the box, doing more problem solving, allowing families to live together and not separating them, and learning from each other and supporting each other. Human beings are meant to support each other. We're not meant to be, an island and live all alone on our own. And that's really, especially in a time when society is very complex and very fast moving, it's really hard. It's hard to raise a child on your own.
Darren, did you want to say anything? I've just been hogging the whole show tonight.
No, I just been listening to what you guys are talking about, taking notes.
Okay, we're going to continue then.
Yes, continue away. I'll come in here in a second when you guys slow up a little bit, and I'll ask some of my questions that I've been writing down.
So,
no problem.
Now I don't know who you're voting for, and you don't have to say, but I will say that I'm voting for the one with the policies. That's all I'm going to say. But right now, the Biden-Harris administration has signed executive orders about kinship, right? The problem I have with this, I have a couple of problems. My first problem is because I will not let a CPS worker walk through my door and I will not sign a contract with the state. They don't want to consider me a kinship provider. Fine. That's one of my problems. My other thing is, how can we work on something, even if it's federal, because I'm going to be once this election's over, because you already said it, Virginia's got election every goddamn year. I'll be working with the Warner, and we'll see if Kane goes back in, or McCain, or whatever his name is. I believe that if we have grandparents, aunts, uncles, fictive kin, if we take these kids in, we shouldn't have to sign a contract with the state to be getting foster care money. What's your thoughts?
So there was a bill that passed this past year in Virginia that should be better than what Virginia has been doing for the last however many years, which requires the child doesn't have to go into foster care, but the relative can still get money to care for the child, and requires the DSS to work with the parent so that the child can come home to the parent. Because, that's my big problem with, putting a child, everybody's like, oh, kinship care, kinship care, kinship care. I'm like, yeah, that's great, but not if we're not helping get the family back together. Yes, it's less bad than putting the child in foster care with a stranger, but it's not better if, first of all, we're not giving the relative enough money to care for the child. And it's not better if we're not helping the family get back together, whether it's by allowing the family to live together in one house, which, like I just said, I think we should do more of, or it's just not, doing what, helping the family, whatever it is, to be reunited. And we certainly shouldn't be putting families in a situation where the parent, I've had grandparents tell me, oh, I don't think the child should go back to my daughter or my son. That I think that's a problem. I don't think it should be up to the grandparent to decide whether their child or their daughter or their son is a good enough parent yet. Some of these grandparents can be, kind of perfectionists. They can be possessive of the child. So I don't think we should be pitting families against each other that way. I do think it is true that the Biden-Harris administration has done a lot to emphasize kinship care, and I think that's great. And the other thing that they did that I just think is really wonderful is, and you and I have talked about this, and that is that until it still hasn't gone into effect yet, it won't go into effect until January, but the attorneys that are appointed to parents when their children are removed, since the year 2000, they've been paid $120 to represent the parent. And that's clearly not enough. It wasn't enough 20 years ago. Or 24 years ago. And it's certainly not enough now. So last year when I was working on this bill, I, went on one of those calculators where you can go on and see how much is $120 worth today from year 2000. Well, it's worth $64. And so, attorneys were not doing the work. And if they were taking the case, they were just showing up to court. And, you can't really blame them. You can't live on, just going to court. Well, it takes you however long to get there. Then, if anybody's ever been to court, that they say, okay, show up at 9 o'clock, and you show up at 9 o'clock and they're like, oh, we have 6 cases in front of you and we're still on number 3. And so by the time your case is heard, it's actually 1 p.m. So, I've sat in plenty of courthouses just sitting there twiddling my thumbs, A lot of courthouses, they won't even let the attorney bring their phone in. So you're lucky if the attorney has their phone, so at least they can answer emails and do something, useful while they're there. But, so if you're getting paid the year 2000 equivalent of $64, you're not going to take these cases, right? So, very few attorneys were taking them. But one of the things that was really able to make a difference was the Biden-Harris administration did pass a new rule where in the past, that Title IV-E money, states were allowed to use that money to pay for attorneys for a child, attorneys for the CPS, but not attorneys for the parent. And so the states weren't prioritizing parents' attorneys because they weren't getting federal dollars for it. So the Biden-Harris administration made a new rule that allows states to use that money for parent attorney compensation. And that was the thing that finally we have had bill after bill after bill to increase the amount of compensation that parents' attorneys get. And those bills have passed the General Assembly, but the budget amendment to pay for it hasn't. Year after year after year. Ever since 2015, we have had these bills. Like I said, the bills have passed, but the budget amendment, and if a bill passes, but the budget amendment to fund it doesn't pass, that's considered an unfunded mandate, and we don't have unfunded mandates in Virginia. So what they do is they put this clause on it that says the bill will only go into effect if the budget amendment passes as well. So basically the budget, even though the bill passed, it would die because the budget amendment didn't. So, but because of that rule, I had to go to, it's complicated. It's a Title IV funds, it's a matching fund, and it's based on the penetration rate. So I had to actually go to not only the legislators, but also the staff of the money committees and sit down with them and explain how it worked and give them the federal rule so that they could read it themselves. And they would even call me at like 9 p.m. at night and say, all right, am I understanding this correctly, that this means this? And I'm like, yes, you're understanding it correctly. And I was so glad, they were taking it really seriously. But the reason why the Biden-Harris administration did that is because in some states they have, and we're still working on trying to get this in Virginia, they have what's called the holistic legal representation model. And that's where, instead of what we have in Virginia, where you go to court and the court says, okay, I'm appointing, attorney X to represent you. Instead, they have an office, kind of like a public defender office. And when I was a public defender, we had, the attorneys who worked there, but we also had a social worker who worked with us. That social worker in the public defense system is called a mitigation specialist or a sentencing specialist. And that person goes, they're not an attorney. They go and they meet with the client. They talk about, well, what are your needs? What are your hopes or your dreams? What's your background? What are your issues? What are the things that you need to either get some services to help you or enable your attorney to argue that you should get a lesser sentence rather than a greater sentence. And of course, you also have the support staff. You have someone who answers a phone and writes down your appointments for you and deals with all the keeping the lights turned on and stuff. And so in a holistic office, you have not just the attorneys who represent the parents, but you have the social workers who are not CPS social workers. They are parent-focused social workers. And, so like I went to a conference once and the person presenting is like, I don't even call those people social workers. I call them case workers, the people who work for CPS, because they are working a case. They are not helping anybody. So the social workers who work, we call them parent side social workers. They work with the parent and figure out what does the parent need rather than what does CPS told you have to do? What do you need? And then they also typically have parent advocates. And those are parents like you, Tiffany, who know the system from the inside because you've gone through it and you know what it takes to get through the other side. And you can sit there, you can hold someone's hand when they're crying and saying, oh, I can't do this. You can go with them to their meetings and speak up for them. You can just be there and help them get through it. And there's really nobody like that other than a parent who's gone through the system. I'm really lucky. I did not go through the system. I also actually recently learned that my mom was threatened with CPS intervention once when I was a kid. And luckily that never happened. But, it just shows you that really nobody is safe. I was homeschooled and the school district basically said, oh, if you don't send your kids to school, we're going to call CPS and have them, remove your children for being truant. So she got a lawyer from the ACLU and the lawyer fought for them. And we did not end up we were allowed to be homeschooled, but that was very long.
Hold on a minute, Valerie, yeah. Speaking of the ACLU, they will not take CPS cases.
That is a source of real frustration to me because I think that they should. And I think in some places they are. I serve on a bunch of national committees and there are people from some ACLU, state ACLUs who do attend those meetings and serve on those committees. The Virginia ACLU, though, they did for a while, they had this women's defense fellow. And she worked on some issues around women who are pregnant and use substances to help limit the implications of that for women. She helped with a woman was charged with child abuse because she used substances while she was pregnant. And I'm like, okay, this is impossible because a fetus is not a child. They do not become a child until after they're born. So you can't abuse a child when there is no child. And yet this woman was charged with criminal child abuse. And so she wrote a brief to prevent this woman from being convicted. And the judge was like, well, I want to convict her of child abuse, but the Virginia law does not recognize that a fetus is a child. So I can't, even though I want to. Basically, that was what their opinion was that they wrote. But, and the surprising thing to me is sometimes doctors would be like, well, if a woman comes to my office and she's pregnant and she's using drugs, then I should support her to CPS, right? And I'm like, you're a doctor. You know that is not a child until after they're born. So why are you even asking this question? I'm not a medical professional. I should not have to explain this to you. But yeah, that's a really good issue. But anyway, so we worked on trying to reduce the change the law that so it's federal law that you have to if a child is born exposed to substances, that they have to be reported to CPS. But we tried to limit that and make it very small so that the law now says that is not per se child abuse or neglect. And then the only reason for it is data collection and so that a plan of safe care can be put into place. And the doctor is actually not supposed to call CPS unless the child is born affected by that substance exposure. So it's not enough to be exposed. And by the way, any woman who has had an epidural has fentanyl in her system. And so a mom called me. She's on MAT. And she called me because her child was removed in the hospital because she tested positive for fentanyl. And they're like, "Oh, you took fentanyl." And she's like, "No, I didn't take fentanyl. I'm an MAT. I did not take fentanyl." And it's like, "Well, you have this drug test that shows you took fentanyl." Well, it wasn't until after the child was removed. And she even told her own attorney this. And the attorney is like, "That's ridiculous. They would never give it an addict fentanyl." I'm like, this is ignorance. So when I first started doing this work, that was one of the things I did. I was like, I called my sister. My sister works in healthcare, and she is a nurse anesthetist. So she gives people anesthesia. And I'm like, is fentanyl in the cocktail that they give a woman for an epidural? And she's like, yeah, every single epidural has fentanyl in it. And if you read, you'll learn that passes through the umbilical cord to the child. So if you test a child's blood after birth, they're going to test positive for fentanyl. And that's especially true, so yeah, if you have an epidural, which most women do, not all, but most do. And so it wasn't until after this woman's child was removed that they discovered that she was right all along, that she did not take the fentanyl. It was administered to her in the epidural. And even her own attorney didn't say, "Wait a minute, let's do a continuance so that we can investigate this case." Instead, they say, "Oh, you must be lying because they would never give an addict fentanyl." Well, they give it to everybody. It's in a cocktail of other things. But yeah, it's in there because it's a very effective painkiller. And
I have three.
Numbs you down. Yeah, completely numbs you, right? It's actually kind of scary because they can't really control it. When they give you the epidural in your spine, it can make it hard for you to breathe. I thought I couldn't breathe. I was breathing, but it felt like I wasn't. Yeah, so it's scary. But that's the kind of thing that ACLU got involved in that, but it was only because they had an attorney who was focused on women's rights. And it was a fellowship. It was a 2-year fellowship. So when she finished her fellowship, she left. She actually went on to the Pregnancy Justice Organization, National, I forget what it's called, National Justice for Pregnant Women or something like that in New York. So she's doing good at work up there, but it's really frustrating that ACLU is not getting involved. And every time I reach out to them and say, "Hey, are you interested in this?" They're like, "Well, we have so many other issues we're working on." So a few of them do, but Virginia isn't working on it.
Yeah, Virginia definitely is not. And it's heartbreaking, right? Because they're supposed to be about the civil rights and all that. But you're literally hearing parents call you, telling you their rights are being violated, and you won't take the case. Not just their rights, but their children's rights. Okay, Darren, go ahead.
All right, where were we here? You guys covered so much that you did. That was pretty much everything in a nutshell. Do you know? All right, so here's the thing. My thing is this void ab initio. Obviously, you know what void ab initio is, right? The concept or what it does or what it's for. So I've put together, because the void ab initio doesn't have to be adjudicated. So I put together this thing. I've been reading about this.
Well, it does have to be. It does have to be adjudicated.
Well, so the standard says that it doesn't have to be. You can just place it and put it into the courts and just set it in as a record, and it does not have to be adjudicated on.
It does have to be adjudicated. It has to be adjudicated that that's what it is. Because there's a lot of things that, like, here's an example. Somebody reached out to me the other day to ask me about annulling a marriage, and I'm like, there's a bunch of situations where where it's voidable versus void ab initio. But a court has to decide which it is. You can't go and say, "Well, I've annulled my marriage because I just realized that, when I got married, it was under this category, which is void ab initio. And so therefore all I have to do is say, hey, my marriage is annulled." It doesn't work that way. Somebody has to declare it. A judge has to declare it and say, yes, this meets the standard. So you can, a judge has to. So it does have to be adjudicated. It's certainly true that once the court, hears the facts, and so like with an annulment, it's like, oh, if you, so bigamy, for instance, that's void ab initio. So if you get married and you're already married, you get married to a new person, then that marriage is void. But the court has to declare it. The judge has to declare that that's the case. Now, of course, with that particular one, it's also a crime to be, the crime of bigamy. So
Right.
better avoid it in the first place. But yeah, it does have to be adjudicated. It's just that it doesn't need to be, the legality of it doesn't need to be argued the way other things would have to be argued. So if it's just something that's voidable, then you would argue, should it be voided? Shouldn't it be voided? Does it meet the standard? Does it not meet that standard? This is a case where you walk into the court and say, hey, I married this guy, and then I found out that he was already married. And the judge is like, okay, well, that's a void marriage, and I'm declaring it void. But you still have to go through that process. It's just that there's not going to be lawyers there fighting about whether it is or isn't one way or the other.
Right. Well, that's fine. I'm going to send you some things so that way you can see what I was looking at and you can see where I come from on it. That's fine.
Okay.
Just because, why are people not beating CPS in the courts? Like, why are people not winning?
Well, the thing is, one is that, like we were talking about earlier, a lot of judges believe, it's just like the way judges believe the police most of the time, they don't understand. I'll use an example. So a few years ago, I was representing this person, and her child was in foster care. Her rights were terminated. I appealed the termination of her rights, and I won. Well, just because you win termination of parental rights, it means your parental rights are restored. It doesn't mean your child is immediately given back to you, right? They still have custody of your child. So you now have to go through custody. You have to go through the whole process as if their rights weren't terminated in the first place, but the child was still in foster care. So this agency was really upset that I had won. I don't know what their issue was, because originally they were like, oh, she's doing so great, her child should come home to her. And all of a sudden they changed their mind. I don't know what was going on. Afterwards, the DSS director left and they got a new director, and it seemed like the case went very differently from there on out. But anyway, in the meantime, my client moved to another state and she had another child. And when she had the new child in the other state, they discovered that she had a CPS case in Virginia. And so they moved to remove that child right after the child was born. So, but the judge didn't remove the child. So they go to court to have the child removed, and the judge is like, well, show me where she has done anything to put this child at risk. And they couldn't prove that because she hadn't done anything. And so the judge is like, well, I'm not going to remove because there's not, she hasn't done anything to abuse or neglect the child. So I'm not going to remove the child. Well, so then when we went back into court for the case in Virginia, they had gotten those court records gotten, I guess, the information from the other state. And they put together a foster care plan about my client in Virginia, saying that her child had been removed in the other state, which hadn't happened. They tried, but they didn't succeed. Right. And so I read this foster care plan, and it's full of these allegations from the other state that were not true. So I got all the court records from that state. I got the certified copies, which I had to pay for. And I wrote like a 10-page motion to the judge, and it said, the motion was to either require a new foster care plan or to throw out this foster care plan. And in it, I said, the foster care plan, page such and such, paragraph blah, 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 says X, Y, and Z, and that is incorrect as shown in attachment A, court order from this other state. And so everything was like that throughout the whole thing. And, it took me quite a while to get those records from the other state. It took me quite a while to write this motion, go through the foster care plan, pick out all the things that were wrong, write what was correct, and cite the proper court order, blah, blah, blah. So we go to court, and the judge has my motion with all those court documents attached to it. And she reads it, and she is shocked. She is completely shocked. You know why? Because her whole career of doing these cases, she has always read those foster care plans, and she has always believed what's in them. She has always believed that that department has written true things in there, that they are telling the court true things about the parents that are coming into the court. And for the first time, she is seeing that the things that were in the foster care plan were not true. And they were demonstrably not true, because I have the actual court records, certified copies from the court that shows that they're not true. And she is appalled. And so she says, we're going to continue this case, and I'm going to require a corrected foster care plan that is supported by the evidence. That was the first time that anyone had ever questioned and had evidence to show that the foster care plan allegations were false. And that was a big eye opener for her. And then the other thing I did was, so after I won the termination of her rights in the Court of Appeals, we had, this foster, what they call the family partnership meeting about, visitation. And they're like, okay, we're going to set up visitation. We're going to do it like this and that, blah, blah, blah. And we go to court, and they say, okay, we are proposing this visitation plan, blah, blah, blah. And the court says, okay, yes, I approve that visitation plan. That's how the visitation plan should go. Now, if you've had one of these cases, that a lot of times the judge does not order visitation, but instead says visitation is left up to the discretion of the CPS. Well, in this case, she didn't do that. She said visitation as described in the foster care plan. So that that foster care plan meeting, family partnership meeting, was in November. The court hearing was in December. So now, and I found out that I won the case earlier in that summer. So first we had to go through the hearing where they said that my, client's other child, had been taken away by the court, which wasn't true. So we had to get through that and prove that that was false. So now it's December, and finally the court, has a corrected foster care plan in front of it, and a visitation plan, which the judge approves and orders that plan be implemented. So then January comes around, and my client calls me and says, hey, I haven't been able to have visitation with my child. And I said, well, what's going on? She said, well, I called, and they said that they weren't going to let me have visitation until they first get a new therapist for the child. And I'm like, well, that's stupid. But so I called them, and I said, why are you doing this? And they're like, oh, well, the child hasn't seen his mom in 2 years. I'm like, oh, well, whose fault is that? And so first the child needs a new therapist to help him, meet with his mom again. It's going to be traumatic, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, okay, well then do that and then set up visitation. So another month goes by. My client calls me and says, I still haven't had any visitation. And I said, well, what did they tell you? And they said, well, they haven't been able to get a new therapist for the child. I'm like, well, this should not be the holdup. So I call, and they're like, well, we now have a new therapist, so it should be soon. So another month goes by, and my client calls me and says, I've been calling, and now they won't even return my calls. They won't return my calls. They won't answer my calls, nothing. So I call their attorney, and I said, hey, look, I'm going on vacation for a week. And if when I come back, my client has not had visitation with her child, then I'm going to file a show cause motion to have your client, CPS, held in contempt. Well, I come back from vacation, I call my client, and I said, hey, did you have visitation while I was gone? Nope, nothing. So I file a show cause for contempt. And guess what? The attorney doesn't even show up for the contempt hearing. I'm like, what the hell? And so the court calls him, and on the phone he says, well, Judge, I was never served. And I'm like, what? So she looks and she shows, yeah, refused. Well, guess what? He works for a law firm, but he works from home. So the sheriff goes to the law firm, the attorney isn't there. So the law firm refuses to accept service, and he never gets served. And so the judge is kind of like, oh, ha ha ha, these things happen. And I'm like, well, Judge, he should still have been here in court today, because even if he wasn't served, he knew that today was the court date, because I told him. I called the clerk. I asked for a court date. I called him up. I said, this is the court day I have. Can you make it? He said yes. And so that's the date that went into the motion that was filed with the court. And that's the date that he knew, because I emailed it to him. And he's like, well, yes, Judge, it is true. I had actual notice that the hearing was today. And I'm like, you know what? If my client hadn't shown up for that court date, there would have been hell to pay. But because, their attorney doesn't show up, then so what? So then, of course, and I told the clerk at the time, I was like, she's like, oh, well, I'll just put it with the same day as the next court hearing. I'm like, no, I want it before then, because when we have the next hearing, I want the judge to be able to see the evidence of how the visits have been going. And so if there have been no visits, then how is the judge to know how well they're going? So in the end, we had to have it on the same day, because now the court has no days left. And, so the court hears all their evidence, here's all my evidence, and says, well, if I had a parent in here, and I do, who hasn't done what I've ordered them to do, I will hold them in contempt. And so I have to hold the agency in contempt also, if they haven't done what I've ordered them to do. And that probably was the very first time that attorney, I think the reason why he didn't show up was because he was like, ha ha ha, they're never going to find my client in contempt. So why should I even bother to, spend my time going there? And so the problem is that a lot of attorneys are just showing up for the court hearings. They are not doing things like filing a motion, a show cause for contempt, when the agency doesn't do what the judge told them to do. They are not reading the foster care plan, getting the evidence themselves. They're not filing motions for discovery to see what the evidence actually is. And when you get those notes, if you do file a motion for discovery and you get those notes from the foster care agency and you read them, you realize a lot of times the foster care plan, I wouldn't say it's necessarily out and out lies, but it's kind of like, if there's two different ways to look at something, they put it in the foster care plan in the way that looks best for them. They don't give the parent the benefit of the doubt. They give themselves the benefit of the doubt. So when the judge reads that, and they're not reading all the stuff that went into the foster care plan, they're reading the foster care plan. So I now make it a practice to always get all those records, demand all those, and they will fight. They will fight and say, oh, you don't have a right to these records. I'm like, well, then fine. I will ask the judge to compel you to give me those records. And the first time I did that, the judge was like, well, don't you have all the stuff that's been filed in court? And I said, yes, of course I have all the stuff that's been filed in court. What I don't have is all the stuff that informs what's been filed in court. And he's like, well, why do you need that? And I said, because I've learned that what is in these papers may not accurately reflect what actually happened. And without seeing the records of what actually happened, I have no way of knowing how correct this is. And he's like, well, I'm not going to order them to give you discovery, but I'm sure they will give you everything. And I'm like, well, if they would give me everything, then why did I have to file in court for them to give me everything that I've asked for? Because they haven't given me everything. They've been standing here in court saying that they don't have to give me everything. Right. And so anyway, so then they did give me everything. 2 days before the TPR hearing, they gave me everything. Luckily, I was working with a law school and I had a whole bunch of students to sift through it all. So we were able to glean out the stuff that actually helped us win. So we did win. So they are winnable. I will say that there is definitely a trend for more judges to be more suspicious of DSSS. So there's a case, and I want to say it's Alexandria. I may not be completely right about that. And it's I would say it's an amazing case. And I was reading this, I was like, wow, this is amazing. So in this case, mom fled her husband from whatever country they were from, somewhere in Central America, to get away from him because he was abusive, came to this country, and then she had some kind of mental breakdown. And so the child ended up going into foster care. They reached out to dad back in the home country. Dad says, well, I can't come to the country. I don't have a visa. I can't come there. But I will go to take family therapy here. I will take a parenting class here. I will do what I can here. And in the meantime, I'll try to get a visa to come to the US. So it takes him a long time, and I think he does take a parenting class, and he does do a bunch of other things. But he doesn't do everything they want. And meanwhile, they interview other people who say, oh yeah, dad is abusive, blah, 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 blah. But of course, that's all hearsay. That's not, actual evidence. Anyway, dad actually gets a visa and shows up in court at his termination hearing. And the judge terminates his rights because he says, well, the judge says, it was Fairfax. I think it was Alexandria. I'm pretty sure it was Alexandria. And basically terminates his rights and says, well, you haven't been involved in this child's life. And he's like, what? I have had phone calls with him. I've had, video chats with him. I took the parenting class they told me to take. I've done this and that. I understand, that I, need to be better at discipline and not be physically a disciplinarian, blah, blah, blah. So they terminated his rights. Well, the Virginia Court of Appeals just overturned that termination. And
Hard. That's
Sweet.
hard here in Virginia.
Yep.
Sweet.
And then I also just got a case. There's a case out of Charlottesville where it was a similar kind of thing where they did not give the parent credit for the work that they had done to, I think it was another situation where they kept moving the goalposts and saying, oh, you have to do this in addition to all the things you've done. And that was I think that was a couple, a mom and dad who were together. And they did all the things they were supposed to do, did all the visitation, everything, but the DSS, and it was the county of Albemarle, I think that one, kept saying, oh, no, we don't believe that they, understand this or that or the other thing. And the JDR court terminated the parents' rights. The parents appealed to the circuit court. The circuit court denied the termination, and the CPS appealed it to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals upheld the denial of the termination that the Albemarle Circuit Court judge. So I think the judges are finally starting to realize, because, when I told both the attorney who had sent me that first case, the Alexandria case, it's interesting because, some of these attorneys, I actually had this was one of the best things that's ever happened in my life, where one of the social workers on that case where the judge finally held the DSS in contempt, one of the social workers contacted me a couple years ago, and she said, I don't know if you remember me, but I used to be a social worker at such and such CPS, and I was so inspired by you. I went to law school, and now I'm representing parents in these cases. So I think, I told the attorney who reached out to me and said, woohoo, I won this case. Attorneys reach out to me to get advice and stuff about their cases, and this was one of the attorneys who had done that. And it was just really satisfying, to get that, to have people doing that. And I told the attorney, I read these cases all the time. The Supreme Court keeps a running list of TPR cases, and you go and you read them, and it's like, this appeal is without merit. For the following reasons, we affirm. It is very rare for them to be overturned. And it seems like more and more of them are starting to be overturned. I think judges, you, Tiffany, said, should judges be trained? I think more judges are being trained. One of the reasons why, so when we got this bill passed this year to increase the amount of money that parents' attorneys are paid, the other thing that we required is that the parents' attorneys get trained. And right now, they do not get trained. They get the same training as a guardian ad litem. And we know the guardian ad litem is trained to represent a child. So the parents' attorneys are trained to represent a child. And that is very different from representing a parent. And so there's actually now a committee being run by the Supreme Court of Virginia to come up with what are those standards and what should the training be.
Oh, Valerie, can you get me into that meeting? I will train these lawyers.
Well, if that training is done, it's going to be run by the Supreme Court of Virginia. And let me tell you, the Supreme Court of Virginia is very, very conservative. And I don't mean that in the political sense, but in the way that Virginia is conservative, which is, we've been doing things this way for 400 years. So we can't change it because this is how we do things here. So it doesn't matter if 49 other states now do things differently. This is Virginia. This is how we do it. We've been doing it 400 years. We're not going to change it. So that's how the Supreme Court of Virginia is. If you bring something to their attention and say, hey, you know, this would be really easy to fix this one little thing, and most other states have done it that way, they're like, well, that's not how we do it. So the Virginia Supreme Court is very conservative in that way. And it's very frustrating to me because I'm a problem solver. I see a problem. I'm like, hey, let's fix it. No brainer. Well, in Virginia, it is a brainer because it goes against, but this is 400 years of tradition. We can't change it. So anyway, I actually recommended some people be on this committee and they did not put any of the people I recommended on it. I know that the reason why they put me on it is because they know if they didn't, I would be raising a big stink. And the legislator who carried the bill would probably come and talk to them and say, I carried this bill because Valerie LaRue asked me to. It passed the General Assembly. She knows more about it than pretty much anybody. She needs to be on this committee. So anyway, they put me on the committee. And of course, I'm sitting there on my hands and mostly it's judges who are on this committee. And so the judges are like, I already don't have enough attorneys. And so if we make these training standards too high, then we'll have no attorneys because nobody will. And I'm like, come on, guys. So it's interesting because one of the people who's there is actually an attorney for Alexandria DSS, and she fought us on trying to bring a pilot program to do that holistic model of legal representation to Alexandria because the Alexandria Bar Association was in support of it. And she's telling me, oh, you know, she's saying in this committee meeting, oh, you know, even the caseworkers don't think that the parents' attorneys are doing a good job. I'm like, well, if you knew that, then why did you fight us on this? Well, it turns out that it was her boss who was fighting it. And so he's now gone. And so now I guess she can speak her mind. But gee, thanks a lot. But anyway, so there is a committee putting together a training program for parents' attorneys. The money will start being raised. So they're still getting the $120. They will start getting $330 beginning January 1st. And for TPRs, and right now the TPR parents are paid the same, whether it's in, they're paid $120 for a TPR in JDR court, and then they're paid big whoop, $158 when they defend the TPR in circuit court. And
Right.
in the last TPR hearing that I did was 12 hours long.
Oh.
Well, so if you did that for $158, well, basically that would pay for, you know, your gas, your lunch,
Maybe.
parking. It wouldn't pay for the work that you did. And it certainly wouldn't pay for the hours. Like I didn't even sleep that night before. I spent the whole night in my office. I went home probably around like 4 a.m. and like laid down next to my husband, just kind of going, I didn't sleep at all. And then I got up and took a shower, went back to the office, and then I drove to court. And, you know, so $158 wouldn't pay for that, right? I had my whole trial notebook all laid out. That's what I spent that whole night doing, was laying out my trial notebook. I had everything together. And, you know, $158 doesn't pay for that. So basically you're doing it essentially for free. Well, under the new bill, not only do you get $330 instead of $120, but for the TPR, and this applies both in the JDR court and in the circuit court, you now get $640. Now we wanted them to pay $1,500. So it's less than half of what we asked for. But it's, you know, a hell of a lot more than they're getting now. And so this last summer, both the Virginia Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court of Virginia raised the amount that they pay attorneys who do criminal appeals, court-appointed criminal appeals. And so I contacted the court and see, this is why they pay attention to me, because I send an email to the person who wrote the press release that says, this is how much the court is paying now. And I was like, hey, does this apply to TPRs also, or just to criminal cases? And they're like, I don't know. I'll check. So they checked and they came back and they said, oh, it only applies to criminal cases, not to TPRs. And I'm like, well, you know what? I'm going to reach out to all the parents' attorneys I know and find out how much they're being paid, because it doesn't even say on the website how much they're being paid. And it doesn't even say in the court's chart of allowances how much they're paid. So it turns out that they were being paid $750. And that's to spend months researching and writing a brief and then going in and giving oral argument. So I was like, well, if we need a bill to increase this, then we'll do a bill to increase this. So then a couple weeks later, the same person I had contacted the Supreme Court reached out to me and said, hey, guess what? They've decided it does apply to TPRs. It's like, yeah, you start shining a spotlight on these things, then you sometimes get some change. So anyway, I'll keep plugging away. I know we're at 8:30 now. I'll keep plugging away on these issues. It takes a while. Like I said, we've been working on this since 2015. Our next push is to get pre-petition legal representation. I have a legislator actually in your neck of the woods, Tiffany, Delegate Reed. He has agreed to carry a budget amendment to cover the cost of adding attorneys to a legal aid office that are dedicated to representing parents before the case goes to court. Now, they can also follow the case to court if it does. But like I said, in other states, they found that if the parents have attorneys before the case goes to court, a lot of times it never even goes to court. And that's what we need. So I had asked him for one attorney. There's 10 legal aid offices or legal aid organizations in Virginia. A lot of them have offices in different, each one has like a central office and then satellite offices. I knew it was going to be too much to ask for one for all the satellite offices. So I was like, can we at least get 10 attorneys? It's true that will cost nearly $1 million by the time you cover all the associated costs, their salaries plus, everything else that fringe benefits and office space, whatever. But can we at least get one for each office? And he said, well, I'll tell you what, how about if we get one for 5 of the offices? And I was like, he's like, and then we can put in there that, if we see the same improvements, then we can ask for the other 5. And he said, and I know that if you got the $1 million today, you would not be able to hire 10 attorneys and train them across the state, in 2 months or 6 months even. I'm like, well, you're right. It takes longer than that. He said, so why don't we do 5 this year? And then we'll come back and ask for 5 in the future. And I'm like, okay, at least that's better than 0, which is what we've got now.
Right.
Anyway, he agreed to carry a budget amendment, and that would be a House budget amendment. Now I need to find a senator to carry it in the Senate, because if you don't have matching budget amendments in the Senate budget and the House budget, then guess what? They negotiate, and one of them gives way to get something else that they want. And nobody wants this, right? This is not like everybody's calling out for it. This is a thing that you have to understand what's going on to ask for it. It's not like there are hundreds of constituents out there saying, I want this. And so if there's not balancing, each budget has it. So then when they go to negotiate, that they say, oh, you've got this, we've got this. Okay, good. That's what you want. You want it to be like, oh, you've got $500,000 and I've got $500,000. All right, we don't have to worry about that. All right, we'll go on to something else where we've got it in our budget here and you only have that in your budget there. And that's what we'll negotiate. So I don't want any negotiating. I want it to be in both budgets. So it's just a no-brainer. It just goes through under the radar and everybody's fine. So now I need to find a senator. But Delegate Reed is carrying it in the House. And now I need to find somebody to carry it in the Senate. So if you know somebody, a senator who's interested in it, that would be great. But I'll keep working on it. Right now, what I'm doing is I'm meeting with the legal aides to figure out which 5 it will be. And so we're looking at, do they have capacity to add another attorney? Also, do they have members of the money committees in their area that they can, that will want to support it, stuff like that. So just working on it. Hopefully we'll get that, but I think that will make a big difference. It's also possible. So one thing we haven't talked about, and I know we're after 8:30, but
Go ahead.
One thing we haven't talked about is the Office of the Children's Ombudsman. And I will say that I know that a lot of people have called me and told me the Office of Children's Ombudsman did not help them and just told them, what they felt like the DSS was doing. But I'll tell you that, and his report just dropped, so you can read it. He is also recommending pre-petition legal representation.
Finally,
and
he's doing something. Send me
yep.
that report when we get off.
Okay, I'll do that. And so the Office of the Children's Ombudsman is under the governor's
Oh,
office.
Jesus.
So he has asked the governor to support this. Now, whether the governor will or not, we don't know. You know, the
Well,
governor's office is kind of like a black box.
wait a minute. He should not think like that because he signed an executive order, his first day, executive order number 2, parental rights. So he should really, really not put his foot in his mouth.
Well, that's the thing. And, you know, and I keep telling people this, if we are for parental rights, we can't just be in favor of wealthy parents who are going to school board meetings and complaining about what books their children are reading. We should be supporting parents who are worried about their children being taken away from them. And you can't support one kind of parent and not support another kind of parent. And you have to be for all parents. And that's really not fair. So anyway, yes, I will send you that report. And thanks for letting me just talk on and on.
Well, we want you to come back on, but
Yes,
I know
yes,
I
there's
know
so
you're
much
busy.
more, right? So much more.
Yeah,
Well,
we want you to come back on when it's convenient for you because I know you're so busy and I just love you to death.
well, I love you too, Tiffany. I'm so glad you're out there in the community fighting. And I know you fight for a lot of parents in your community, and that's so great. So maybe what we can do is maybe in January when the General Assembly session starts and that budget amendment, hopefully 2 budget amendment is filed, maybe some other legislation is filed, we can come on and talk about it and people can know like how to contact their legislator and advocate for these things because it makes a difference. You know, I'm a lot of times, I mean, I joke about this and I'm really lucky that things are changing, but I used to say, you know, every time I go into a space, everybody's like, oh, I'm here for child. I'm like, I'm here for the parents. I don't care about children. I only care about parents. And, you know, I joke because I would be the only person in the room who cared about parents. And from my point of view, caring about parents is caring about the child. But, you know, that is starting to change. I'm starting to not be the only person in the room. And I think legislators are starting to hear, but they've been hearing from me, you know, and when I first started going and talking to legislators and saying, we need to increase the amount of money that parents' attorneys get paid, they're like, oh, well, why should bad parents get good attorneys? That's what people would tell me. Legislators would tell me to my face. And of course, it was, I'm sure my face probably showed that I thought that was a really stupid and terrible thing to say. But I would be very calm and I would say, well, first of all, they have not been proven to be bad parents until they've gone to court. And second of all, it's best for children to be with their parents. And the data shows that when the parents have better attorneys, the outcomes for the children are improved. And that's why you should pay for good attorneys for bad parents, just like you do in the criminal justice system. It's the same principle. Our justice system does not work unless people have good attorneys.
Did the article that I was in, did you send it to all the legislators? Did they read it?
I printed it out. I gave them a packet with the bill information. This year, so last year we didn't get the bill passed, but this year we did. And I included that article and the state bar. So the state bar actually supported the bill this year. In the past, I spoke to them and they're like, oh, well, we don't take a position on legislation. Then I found out that in 2005, they had taken a position on legislation to improve the rate of pay for criminal defense attorneys. And I found that they had written a letter to then Governor Kane in support of it. And the reason why I actually found out was a legislator told me, oh, we weren't able to get this until the state bar took an interest and wrote a letter. So I basically spent 9 months lobbying the Virginia State Bar to support this effort, and they did. And that letter, I would put that on top. They sent it to all the legislators, and the legislators did not read it because it came in an email and they don't read their email. So I printed it out and I said, oh, and by the way, the state bar is supporting it. And here's a letter that they wrote to you, which you probably haven't read, but I printed it out for you so you can read it. And that really made a difference. They were like, oh, the state bar? Oh. So it also makes a difference. So it's not just me going in and telling them this stuff, to hear from their own constituents, because they're the ones that are going to be holding them responsible and accountable. You know, come like we were just talking earlier, there's an election this November. Well, you know, they need to hear from the community what is important to them. Like I said, a lot of times they're going to be like, oh, is this bill am I going to lose my next election because I supported this bill? Well, they need to hear that they will lose the election because they didn't support the bill.
Yeah.
They need to hear from you. So yeah, doing it in early January when we know what the bills are and I can tell you what they are. And, if people want to give me their emails, I will send them action alerts and say, hey, the bill is coming up on Tuesday. You should write to your legislator today.
Well, you send me the emails and then I go on each one. Everyone you send me, I'm like, support this bill because.
Yep. That really makes a big difference. And this year, so many people reached out to their legislators and said, you need to support this bill. I had legislators telling me, oh, I heard from my constituent, would you talk to them? I'm like, sure, I'll talk to anybody. But I was like, wow, these are even people that I don't know. So they didn't hear it from me. They didn't call you because I asked them to. They called you because they learned about this and they are supporting it. So, yeah.
Well, that's great.
Well, thank you so much, Tiffany, for having me on. And
it is my pleasure. I am honored.
Well, I'm honored too. So I really appreciate what you're doing in the community. That is so important. What I'm doing is at the General Assembly, but you're working in the community and parents who don't know where to turn or don't know what to do have you to advocate for them and, tell them what their rights are. And that's so important.
I know, because CPS tells them they ain't got no rights. The judges, I'm like, bullshit. Look here. You're going to tell this judge that if they don't listen to you about your rights, you will leave their courtroom when this court hearing is over, and you are going to call a civil rights attorney. Watch how fast your hearing is going to turn around.
Yep. They're not used to that.
Nope. You got to stand your ground.
Yep. All right.
Well, I'm
going
to let you go. You too. Send me
I'll do
that
it right
bill.
now. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Darren.
I got you.
Darren, we can end the show now.
I'm coming.
Every day, I try to get every day. I try to say for those who have been isolated. Don't be worried, you have a voice today. So listen up, everyone. Here is the story. Child protection, what they call it. They want our kids because it fills a lot of people's wallet. We all think it won't be us. We say when they come we will be so tough. It all sounds good when there's no one to take them. But when they come, your voice gets to breaking. Stay calm, step away. CPS ain't taking no one today. We are educated. I know the tricks up your sleeves. You can't do what you're trying to do. We have done our homework. Don't do a damn thing without a warrant. You no longer will steal our kids this way. Tiff and the Punisher have come for the calling. They are giving us the CPS warning. Their voice is loud and clear. We stop losing our kids this year. Tiff wants to fight the entire planet. She is tired of our kids being taken. Goddammit. She's been fighting CPS for 30 years, bringing children home from this disgusting mess. The Punisher is screaming out loud, abolish CPS and tear it down. I want all our kids to come back. Look at all those kids, pictures held up like theater tags. Together we are stronger than we need. We will tear down CPS with high speed. We will do so much being together. Birds of a feather flock together. So watch out, CPS, here we come.